August 1914. A sea of faces in Munich's Odeonsplatz. The air crackles with energy as a nation holds its breath, waiting for the news that will change the world. Then the announcement comes. War. The crowd erupts. Hats are thrown in the air. Strangers embrace in a tidal wave of patriotic joy. Now, look closer. There's a famous photograph of this moment, and in that ocean of humanity, one face stands out. It's not just cheering. It's pure ecstasy. A look of religious rapture, as if this man has just found his salvation. This is the story of that man, a failed artist, a drifter living in poverty, named Adolf Hitler. He went to that square looking for a purpose. He would find it in a nightmare that would consume him, and then the world. Before this moment, Hitler's life was a study in failure. At 25, he was a ghost haunting the streets of Vienna and Munich, a man with no education, no family, and no prospects. He slept in homeless shelters, scraping by, selling hand-painted postcards to tourists. His dream of being a great artist had been crushed. The Vienna Academy of Fine Arts rejected him twice. They said his buildings were decent, but he couldn't draw people. He lacked soul. An awkward, intense outsider, his only companions were his frustrations and a towering resentment for a world that refused to recognize his genius. He was drowning in mediocrity, and he knew it. Then, Germany declared war on Russia. For millions, it was a moment of dread. For Adolf Hitler, it was a deliverance. He later wrote that he fell to his knees and thanked heaven. This wasn't just a war for territory or politics. For him, it was a spiritual event, a chance to be reborn, to wash away the shame of his pathetic, lonely existence and become part of something monumental, something glorious, the German Reich. He immediately petitioned the King of Bavaria for permission to enlist. As an Austrian, he shouldn't have been allowed to serve in a German army. Bureaucracy could have stopped him right there. His story could have ended, another footnote of a forgotten man. But the gears of war were grinding, and they needed bodies. The rules were bent. The request was approved. Suddenly, Adolf Hitler, the reject, belonged. The uniform was more than just clothing. It was a new skin. It erased the past. He was no longer a failed painter. He was Private Hitler of the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment, known as the List Regiment. For the first time in his life, he was surrounded by men who accepted him as one of their own, all bound by a common thrilling purpose, to fight and die for the fatherland. For Hitler and the other volunteers, this certainty was intoxicating, a cause so powerful you would throw your entire life at it, no questions asked. They marched through German towns on their way to the front, showered with flowers and praise. They sang patriotic songs, believing the war would be a swift, heroic adventure. Over by Christmas, the posters promised it. The newspapers confirmed it. Their officers assured them of it. Their romantic vision of war was a complete fantasy. In late October 1914, they arrived in Flanders, Belgium. The landscape was a preview of hell. The sky was a permanent weeping gray. The sound of artillery, a distant, constant thunder, grew louder with every mile. This was not the glorious cavalry charge they had imagined. This was something new, industrial, impersonal. Their first major engagement was near the city of Ypres. They were part of a massive German offensive meant to break through the British lines. The List Regiment was filled with young volunteers like Hitler, students, clerks, factory boys. They were passionate, brave, and almost completely untrained for the warfare that awaited them. They were ordered to advance across open fields toward the British positions. They went forward singing Die Wacht am Rhein, a famous patriotic anthem. They marched in neat lines, just as they'd been taught, a display of German spirit and discipline. The British soldiers waiting for them were not young volunteers. They were professionals, hardened veterans of Britain's colonial wars. And they had machine guns. What happened next was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The British Maxim guns opened up, spitting hundreds of rounds a minute. The German lines were shredded, the singing replaced by screams. Men who had been cheering in Munich just weeks before were now clawing at the mud, their bodies torn apart. The attack was a catastrophic failure. The romantic dream of war died in that Belgian field, drowned in blood. In just a few days, the List Regiment was gutted. Of the 3,600 men who went into the fight, only about 600 were left standing. The commander was killed. So were most of the other officers. This single event became known in Germany as the Kindermord bei Ypres, the Massacre of the Innocents. And through it all, one man survived, Adolf Hitler. He was there, in the thick of the chaos, the noise, the terror. He saw his new comrades, the first real brothers he ever had, fall all around him. He felt the ground shake from the explosions. He breathed the air thick with smoke and death. And he lived. For his bravery, he was promoted to corporal and recommended for the Iron Cross, second class. He had survived a battle that killed most of his comrades. He had faced the industrial machine of modern war and walked away. This baptism of fire and blood forged something new and dangerous inside him. The failed artist was gone. In his place, a soldier had been born, a soldier who now believed he had been spared by destiny itself. Most soldiers in World War I died in the trenches. They died waiting for an attack or making one. But some, like Corporal Adolf Hitler, had a different job. They were called dispatch runners. Their task was to run messages through the heart of the death zone. This wasn't frontline combat. It was a lonely gamble with artillery, snipers, and madness. For a man who had felt invisible his entire life, the uniform of the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment was a new skin. The List Regiment, as it was known, became his family, his university, his entire world, and his role within it was that of the Meldeganger, the runner. In an age before reliable field radios, communication depended on a man with a leather pouch and a desperate hope of reaching his destination. This was Hitler's new profession, not painting postcards of Vienna, but carrying pieces of paper that could mean life or death for hundreds of men. The Western Front in 1915 was not a place for grand heroics. It was a landscape of industrial slaughter. The sky was a permanent smear of gray, the air thick with the smell of wet earth, chloride of lime, and cordite. Life was measured not in days, but in the seconds between artillery shells. For most soldiers, this was an unbearable existence. They wrote letters home filled with despair, drank their rations of schnapps to forget, and talked of women and farms and a life that felt 1,000,000 miles away. Hitler did none of these things. For him, the chaos of the front was a strange kind of order. There were superiors to obey, duties to perform, and a clear singular purpose: the victory of Germany. The squalor of the trenches was preferable to the squalor of the men's hostel in Vienna. Here, his life had meaning. He was no longer a failed artist. He was a German soldier. One evening in October, the rain turned the trenches into canals of thick brown sludge. A British offensive had been grinding on for days, and the German lines were under constant crushing bombardment. The world was reduced to a deafening roar, a low rumble that grew into a physical force, shaking a man to his very bones. The earth shuddered, and the wooden beams of the dugout groaned under the strain. An officer, his face pale and smeared with mud, handed Hitler a sealed oilskin pouch. The message was for the forward command post, less than a kilometer away. A kilometer that might as well have been the surface of the moon. It was a landscape remade by high explosives, a lunar nightmare of overlapping craters, splintered trees, and tangles of barbed wire like vicious metal thorns. Hitler took the pouch without a word. His comrades watched him. They saw no tremor in his hands, no flicker of fear in his eyes, just a quiet intensity. He checked his rifle, adjusted his helmet, and crawled out of the relative safety of the bunker. The moment he was in the open, the world erupted into noise and violence. A shell screamed overhead and landed 50 meters to his left, erupting in a geyser of mud and black smoke. Shrapnel whizzed past his head like angry insects. He didn't dive for cover. He simply adjusted his course, running low, his boots sinking deep into the sucking mud with every step. This was the runner's war, a solitary dance with chance. There was no enemy to see, no one to shoot at. The enemy was the sky, the ground, the very air itself. Every crater could be his grave. Every shadow could hide a sniper. He ran from one shell hole to the next, pausing, listening to the rhythm of the explosions, trying to predict where the next one would fall. It was a useless exercise. Death here was entirely random. During one pause, crouched behind the root ball of a blasted oak tree, an illumination flare burst overhead. It bathed the hellscape in a cold, chemical white light, and in that light he saw him, a fellow German soldier half buried in the mud, his eyes wide open, staring at the sky. He had been running the same path just minutes, maybe hours before. Hitler felt nothing. He registered the body as an obstacle, a landmark, and moved on. He reached the forward command post, a hole in the ground reinforced with sandbags and splintered timber. He delivered the message. The officer inside, a young lieutenant with haunted eyes, simply nodded. "Understood. Get back safely, runner." There was no praise, no gratitude, just the cold mechanics of war. The journey back was just as harrowing, but he made it. He crawled back into his own dugout, covered in mud, but unharmed. He had done his duty. He had proven his courage. He was recommended for the Iron Cross, second class, an award he would receive and cherish for the rest of his life. He had faced the storm of steel and survived, but courage wasn't the only thing his comrades noticed. As the war dragged on from the Somme to Ypres to Passchendaele, they saw something else. In their letters and diaries, they wrote about the strange Corporal Hitler. He never asked for leave. He never complained about the lice or the rats. While others gambled or slept, he would sit in a corner reading political pamphlets or cleaning his equipment with obsessive care. He would sometimes launch into long, rambling monologues about the betrayal of the politicians, the purity of the German race, and the glory of the Reich. The other soldiers would listen for a minute, then shake their heads and walk away. They called him the artist or the madman, often in the same breath. He shared their dangers, but he did not share their lives. He was with them, but not one of them. The brutal bond of the trenches, the brotherhood forged in shared misery, seemed to wash over him without leaving a mark. A soldier who follows every order without question, who faces death without flinching, but who feels no real connection to the men dying beside him. Is that the perfect soldier, or is it something else entirely? He was fighting with an almost inhuman dedication. But his dedication wasn't to the men in his squad. It wasn't for the friend who shared his last cigarette or the man who pulled him out of the mud. He was fighting for an idea, an abstraction, a glorious, powerful Germany that existed only in his mind. This is Lieutenant Hugo Gutmann, a Jewish officer in the German army. He is about to make a decision with unimaginable consequences to recommend a strange, solitary corporal for Germany's highest honor. The Iron Cross, First Class, was an award reserved for exceptional courage. The corporal's name was Adolf Hitler. The war had ground on for 4 long years. 1914 felt like a lifetime ago. The patriotic parades, the flowers tossed at marching soldiers, the promises of a swift victory, all of it had dissolved into the mud and gas of the Western Front. For the men of the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry, the List Regiment, survival was a matter of routine, a grim, repetitive dance with death. But not all soldiers lived in the forward trenches. Behind the lines, at the regimental headquarters, a different kind of war was fought, a war of maps, telegraphs, and reports. This nerve center was a place of relative safety, but one where a single mistake could cost hundreds of lives. This was Corporal Hitler's world. He was a dispatch runner, a Meldegänger. His job was to carry messages from headquarters to commanders at the front. He lived on the edge of the chaos, constantly darting into it and then retreating. His superior officer was Lieutenant Hugo Gutmann. Gutmann was a professional, a career soldier who had risen through the ranks on merit. He was also Jewish. In the Imperial German Army of 1918, this wasn't remarkable. He was a German first. His faith was a private matter. His duty was to the Kaiser and the men under his command. What Gutmann valued above all else was reliability. In the storm of steel that was the Western Front, an unreliable soldier was a liability. A message delivered late, or not at all, could mean an artillery strike going astray, a flank left unprotected, an entire company annihilated. And Corporal Hitler was anything but unreliable. Among the other soldiers, Hitler was an outcast. He didn't drink. He didn't chase women on leave. He didn't complain about the food or the officers. He sat apart, reading, writing letters, or launching into intense, rambling monologues about politics and the fate of Germany. His comrades found him bizarre. They called him the artist, or the madman. They kept their distance. But to the officers, he was a model soldier. He was always present, always alert. His uniform was immaculate, even in the squalor of the rear trenches. He snapped to attention with a crispness that bordered on caricature. He anticipated orders and never questioned authority. Lieutenant Gutmann saw a soldier who did his job without complaint, who faced danger with a stoic resolve, and who showed unwavering loyalty. In an army stretched to its breaking point, such a man was invaluable. Then came the summer of 1918. The final, desperate German offensive was failing. The front was a fluid, chaotic mess. It was during this period that the official act of bravery occurred. The story that went into the records was dramatic. During an intense firefight, Hitler, acting on his own initiative, supposedly captured a group of French soldiers, preventing them from reporting German positions. Another version tells of him single-handedly saving his wounded commander under heavy fire. A lone corporal, turning the tide in a small but critical engagement. It was the kind of story medals were made for. And based on this and Hitler's consistent record, Lieutenant Gutmann wrote the recommendation. He put his name, the name of a German Jewish officer, to the document that would grant Corporal Adolf Hitler the Iron Cross First Class. This was no small thing. The Iron Cross Second Class was common, handed out for general bravery. But the First Class was different. It was typically reserved for officers or for non-commissioned officers who performed acts of truly exceptional, almost suicidal heroism. For a low-ranking corporal to receive it was almost unheard of. It suggested a level of courage that set him far above his peers. But when we look closer, the picture becomes more complex. The historical evidence for this single dramatic act of heroism is thin. No other eyewitness accounts fully corroborate the story. It shifts and changes depending on who tells it. What is far more likely is that the award wasn't for one moment of battlefield glory. It was a reward for 4 years of something else entirely, 4 years of being the perfect subordinate. Hitler wasn't the bravest soldier in the German army. He wasn't the most skilled fighter. But he was, perhaps, the most obedient. He was the ultimate good employee. He understood the system. He knew what his superiors wanted to see, and he gave it to them. He never caused problems. He always said, "Yes, sir." He was a known quantity, a reliable tool in the hands of officers like Gutmann. The Iron Cross may have been less a recognition of battlefield valor and more a final emphatic thank you for his sycophantic efficiency. It reveals an early chilling talent for manipulating authority, for playing the part. Imagine the scene. The medal is pinned to his tunic, a heavy piece of iron and silver. For the failed artist from Vienna, the man who slept in homeless shelters, this was everything. It was validation. It was proof that he mattered. He had served the fatherland, and the fatherland had recognized him. This piece of metal would become central to his identity. He wore it for the rest of his life. It was his shield, his proof of patriotism, a symbol he would use to legitimize his rage and his politics. Hugo Gutmann had simply done his duty. He had rewarded a soldier he thought was deserving. He would survive the war, and for a time, Hitler's regime would even offer him protection because of this very act. A bizarre, temporary shield from the horrors his former corporal was about to unleash. But in that moment, in the summer of 1918, Gutmann had no idea what he had helped create. He had decorated a loyal soldier. He could not see the fanatic simmering just beneath the surface. The medal didn't make Hitler a monster. The monster was already there. But it gave that monster a costume. It gave him a story to tell. The story of a simple, brave soldier, betrayed by his country. How did the man who so eagerly accepted Germany's highest honor from a Jewish officer become the architect of the Holocaust? The answer lies not in the trenches, but in what happened next. In a hospital bed, as the world he fought for crumbled to dust around him. In the middle of the most brutal war in history, Corporal Hitler found something to love. A stray dog he named Fuchsel. This is the story of the only real emotional connection he seemed to make in 4 years of war, and how its loss, a seemingly minor event in a world of cataclysm, mirrored a much larger, darker betrayal that was about to consume him. The year is 1917. The war has ground on for 3 years, a stalemate of mud and blood. For the soldiers of the List Regiment, there is no grand strategy, only the next bombardment, the next patrol, the next day of survival. During a rare lull in the fighting, Corporal Hitler's unit is tasked with clearing a ruined village just behind the lines. It's a ghost town, hollowed out by artillery. Walls stand open to the sky. Furniture lies splintered in the streets. There's a particular kind of silence in these places, the silence of absence. Hitler moves through the rubble of what was once a farmhouse. The air is thick with the smell of damp plaster and old smoke. He steps over a collapsed roof beam, his rifle held loosely. Most soldiers would see only destruction. Hitler, always the failed artist, perhaps saw a grim tableau. Then he hears it, a faint scratching sound, followed by a low whimper. It's not the sound of a rat. It's something else. He signals for the others to wait, his curiosity overriding his caution. He moves toward the sound, picking his way through a pile of bricks and shattered timber. He kneels, peering into the darkness under a large section of collapsed wall. 2 small eyes look back at him. Carefully, methodically, he begins to move the debris. A brick, then a piece of wood, then another. Finally, he clears enough space to see it properly. A small white terrier, its coat matted with grime and dust. It's skinny and shivering, trapped by a fallen rafter resting across its hind legs. The animal is terrified, but it doesn't growl. It just watches him. Hitler reaches in, not with aggression, but with a slow, deliberate calm. He lifts the beam just enough for the dog to pull itself free. It limps for a moment, then stands, shaking. Hitler reaches into his coat and pulls out a piece of his hard, dry bread, his own ration. He breaks off a corner and holds it out on his flat palm. The dog hesitates, then inches forward and snatches the food. In that small exchange, in the ruins of a French farm, Corporal Hitler found a companion. He named him Fuchsel, Little Fox. Back in the trenches, Fuchsel became Hitler's shadow. Imagine their dugout. It's a cramped, damp hole in the earth, lit by a single lantern. The air smells of wet wool, tobacco, and unwashed bodies. In one corner, a group of men play cards, their laughter rough and loud. Another soldier sits alone, painstakingly cleaning his rifle, his movements mechanical. But over in another corner, away from the others, is Hitler. He isn't part of their world. He sits with the small white dog curled on his lap, sharing a piece of sausage from his mess tin. He murmurs to it, his voice low, teaching it a trick. The other soldiers watch him. One of them nudges his friend, whispering just loud enough to be heard. Look at the Austrian and his mutt. Cares more for that thing than for any of us. The comment hangs in the air. It was true. Hitler showed more affection to that dog than to any human being in the regiment. Fuchsel was his escape, a small living piece of something that wasn't the war. But this attachment was not just a comfort. It was a liability, a risk in a world where any mistake could be fatal. Think of a night patrol in no man's land, the terror of moving through darkness with barbed wire waiting to snag you and machine guns ready to open up at the slightest sound. Hitler, unable to bear leaving Fuchsel behind, has the dog tucked inside his greatcoat. It's a foolish, sentimental decision. As the patrol crawls through the mud, a flare erupts overhead, casting the cratered landscape in a ghastly, flickering white light. Everyone freezes. In the sudden silence, Fuchsel, startled by the blinding flash, lets out a tiny, sharp yelp. The sound is like a gunshot in the stillness. Hitler's blood runs cold. He clamps his hand over the dog's muzzle, his eyes wide with panic. The soldier next to him turns, his face a mask of fury in the dying light of the flare. "Keep that thing quiet," he hisses, "or I'll quiet it for you." The threat was real. In that moment, Hitler understood that the one creature he loved, the single source of comfort in his world, could also get him killed. It was another wall between him and his comrades. For another year, Hitler guarded his companion fiercely. Fuchsel learned an array of tricks. He could navigate the trench systems, respond to silent hand signals, and became a sort of unofficial mascot for the regimental headquarters. Hitler doted on him, boasting of his intelligence to anyone who would listen. The dog was his proof of concept, proof that even in this hell he could create a small pocket of order, of loyalty, of devotion. It was a world of two, a world he could control. Then, in August of 1918, the end of the war was in sight, though no one knew it yet. The German lines were bending, then breaking. The army was in a state of constant, chaotic movement. Hitler and his unit were being transported by train through Alsace. The railway station was a scene of total confusion. Steam from the engines filled the air, mixing with the shouts of officers and the low murmur of thousands of exhausted, defeated men. It was a vision of an empire coming apart at the seams. Hitler stood on the platform, Fuchsel at his feet. An officer barked an order, demanding help loading crates onto a carriage. Hitler told Fuchsel to stay, a command the dog had obeyed 1,000 times before. He was gone for only a few minutes. When he returned, the spot on the platform was empty. He scanned the area. Nothing. He called out, his voice calm at first, "Fuchsel?" Then louder, a note of urgency creeping in. "Fuchsel!" He began to push his way through the dense crowd of soldiers, his eyes darting everywhere. The disciplined corporal was gone, replaced by a frantic man. He grabbed a railway worker by the arm. "A dog, a white terrier. Did you see him?" The worker just stared at him, his face blank with exhaustion and indifference. "Soldier," he said, pulling his arm away, "there are 1,000,000 men here. We're losing a war. Who cares about your dog?" Hitler was inconsolable. His rage was bottomless. He offered his entire pay, a week's wages, to anyone who could find his dog. No one could. He was convinced Fuchsel had been stolen. To him, this wasn't just a lost pet. It was a deliberate act of malice, a profound betrayal. The one creature that had offered him unconditional loyalty had been torn away by the greed and chaos of other men. This small personal act of theft, this petty treason, became the emotional blueprint for how he would interpret the national catastrophe to come. The loss cut him deeper than any wound he had received. Does this flicker of humanity, this genuine love for an animal, make Hitler more understandable? Or does it make his later calculated hatred for human beings even more monstrous by comparison? It reveals a man capable of forming a bond, but only with something that could offer him total, unquestioning obedience. The theft of Fuchsel left a scar. It was the first stab in the back, a personal rehearsal for the much grander sense of betrayal he was about to feel. If the disappearance of one small dog could shatter his world, what would the loss of an entire war do to his mind? By 1916, the war was no longer about glorious charges or quick victories. It was about arithmetic. The generals had abandoned the dream of a swift, decisive breakthrough. They now spoke a different language, a language of numbers, of attrition, of acceptable losses. On maps spread across polished tables, hundreds of miles from the front, men in immaculate uniforms and with cold eyes were designing a new kind of battle. Their goal was no longer to conquer territory. Their goal was to bleed an entire nation to death. In the quiet headquarters of the German High Command, General Erich von Falkenhayn pointed to a spot on the map, the ancient fortress city of Verdun. To him, Verdun wasn't a place of historical significance. It was a symbol, a place the French would defend to the last man. And that was precisely the point. He didn't want to capture Verdun. He wanted to turn it into a furnace, a place where he could force the French army to feed its sons into the flames, one division at a time, until there were no sons left. He called it bleeding the French army white. It was a strategy of industrial-scale slaughter conceived in a sterile room to be executed in the mud and blood of the trenches. Every German life was a calculated investment. Every French death, the expected return. The grinding machine was being switched on. But grand strategies have a way of creating echoes. As the German Fifth Army began to pulverize the forts around Verdun, the British High Command planned their own colossal offensive to relieve the pressure on their allies. They chose a quiet, rolling sector of the front, a place of small villages and green fields called the Somme. And that is where the List Regiment, with Corporal Adolf Hitler among its runners, was being moved. He knew nothing of Falkenhayn's cold calculations. He only knew the familiar rumble of the troop trains, the tightening knot in his stomach, and the sight of endless columns of men marching toward a new horizon, obscured by the smoke of 1,000 guns. The Somme was different. Earlier battles had been brutal, chaotic affairs. This was systematic. It was a vision of hell engineered by industry. For 7 days before the main assault, 1.5 million shells fell on the German lines. The noise wasn't a series of explosions. It was a single, continuous, earth-shattering roar that never stopped day or night. It was a sound that vibrated through the bones, shook the teeth, and frayed the very fabric of sanity. Men huddled in deep dugouts, listening to the world above being torn apart. They prayed the British artillery wouldn't find them. Many prayers went unanswered. When the shelling finally lifted on the 1st of July, a strange, terrifying silence fell. Then came the whistles. All along the British line, officers blew their whistles, and tens of thousands of men climbed out of their trenches to walk slowly, deliberately, across no man's land. They had been told the German defenses were obliterated. They were wrong. German machine gunners, who had survived the bombardment deep underground, scrambled to their posts. They looked through their sights and saw the unbelievable rows of British soldiers walking towards them as if on parade. For the men of the List regiment, it was a moment of sheer disbelief, followed by the grim, mechanical duty of slaughter. Hitler was not on a machine gun. His job remained the same: to run, to carry messages from one command post to another through this landscape of industrial death. He and his fellow runners were the nervous system of the trench line. But now the terrain had changed. The world was no longer fields and trenches. It was a lunar landscape of overlapping shell craters, pulverized earth, and the half-buried bodies of the dead. Every run was a gamble with impossible odds. He would hug the earth, crawling from crater to crater, the air thick with the smell of cordite and decay. His little dog, Fuchsel, would often wait for him at the dugout entrance, a small living anchor in a world of death. A direct hit on a dugout turned a shelter for a dozen men into a tomb of earth and splintered wood. He saw comrades he had shared bread with that morning lying in the mud, their faces unrecognizable. Yet, through it all, he seemed to have a supernatural luck. Shells would land feet away, showering him with dirt, but leaving him untouched. Machine gun bullets would zip past his head but never find their mark. His fellow soldiers started to notice. They called it his Glück, his luck. He wasn't reckless, but he was fearless in a way that seemed unnatural. It wasn't bravery so much as a complete surrender to fate. If he was meant to die, he would die. Until then, he would deliver the message. But the grinding machine did not care for luck, it only cared for numbers. Falkenhayn's great plan at Verdun had failed. The French army did not break. Instead, it bled and bled and bled, but so did the German army. The furnace was consuming both sides equally. At the Somme, the British took catastrophic losses, but they kept attacking. The German High Command's cold arithmetic was proving to be a colossal, bloody miscalculation. The generals had designed a war of attrition, believing their nation could endure it better than their enemies. They had misjudged the resilience of the French, the industrial might of the British, and the horrific cost to their own men. For a soldier on the ground like Hitler, this strategic failure meant only one thing: the killing would not stop. The battle raged for months. Summer turned to autumn. The craters filled with rain, creating a nightmarish swamp of mud, wire, and corpses. On October 7th, 1916, near the French village of Bapaume, Hitler and his comrades were resting in a dugout. The familiar scream of an incoming shell. An explosion, closer than usual. A flash of white-hot light. Then, darkness. He woke up to the screams of other men. His leg was on fire, a sharp, searing pain that cut through the shock. A piece of British shrapnel had torn through his thigh. His luck had finally run out. He was bleeding heavily. Comrades dragged him from the ruined dugout, his face pale, his teeth clenched against the agony. He was just one more number in the butcher's bill of the Somme, one more entry in a ledger of pain that stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss Alps. Think about this for a moment. A general, safe in a distant chateau, signs an order that condemns thousands to die, believing it serves a greater strategy. A soldier in a trench, following that order, contributes to the slaughter. Who bears the greater responsibility? The architect of the meat grinder or the cog that keeps its gears turning? As they carried Corporal Hitler to a field hospital, he was leaving the front for the first time in over 2 years. He was leaving the brotherhood of the trenches, the constant presence of death, and the familiar faces of the men who had become his only family. He was being sent back to Germany. For the first time, he would see the home front. He was expecting a nation united in heroic sacrifice, a people steeling themselves for the final push to victory. But the Germany he was returning to was not the Germany he had left. He was leaving the hell of the front line only to discover a different kind of war was being fought back home. A war of hunger, of doubt, and of whispers. Whispers of betrayal that would soon grow into a roar. Imagine a weapon that doesn't explode, a silent yellow-green cloud that rolls across the battlefield, choking the life from the very air you breathe. This was the new terror of the First World War, poison gas, and the man who pioneered it for Germany, a man who believed he was a patriot, would later win a Nobel Prize. By 1916, the war had lost any semblance of movement or glory. For Corporal Adolf Hitler and the men of the List Regiment, life was a cycle of mud, waiting, and sudden, arbitrary death. The grand charges of 1914 were a distant memory. Now the battlefield was a static nightmare of trenches carved into the French soil. The real enemy wasn't always the soldier in the opposing trench. It was the artillery shell with your name on it. It was the sniper's bullet that came out of nowhere. And now it was the wind itself. Rumors had been trickling down the lines for months. Stories of a new kind of weapon. A strange fog that didn't just obscure vision, but dissolved the lungs of anyone who breathed it. Soldiers spoke in hushed tones of men dying in agony, clawing at their own throats, their faces turning black. To the average infantryman like Hitler, it sounded like a ghost story, a myth cooked up to scare new recruits. War was about steel and lead, not phantoms. That day started like any other, a cold, damp morning on the Somme front. The sky was a familiar, oppressive gray. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth, rot, and cordite. Hitler, ever the diligent runner, was likely checking his equipment, keeping to himself as usual. His world had shrunk to the confines of his duty, the letters he wrote, and the small terrier, Fuchsel, who was his only real companion. The war had become a job, a grim, terrifying job, but a predictable one. Then the shelling began. But it was different, not the usual high-explosive barrage that tore the earth apart. These were quiet pops, a soft, rhythmic thumping, as if a giant was gently tapping the enemy lines. The veterans looked at each other, their faces etched with confusion. Something was wrong. The air grew still. The birds went silent. An unnatural quiet descended upon the front. Then They saw it. Rising from the British trenches, a pale, yellowish-green mist. It wasn't like smoke from a fire which rises and dissipates. This cloud was heavy. It hugged the ground, thick and oily, pouring into shell craters and spilling over the top of the trenches like a slow-motion waterfall. It didn't rush. It crept. An unstoppable, silent tide of death. The cry went up, a sound of pure animal panic. "Gas! Gas!" Chaos erupted. Men scrambled, their movements clumsy with terror. They fumbled for the crude gas masks they'd been issued. These weren't the advanced respirators of later wars. They were primitive hoods of rubberized fabric with small celluloid eyepieces. Getting one on was a frantic, suffocating struggle against time. Your own panicked breathing would fog the lenses, blinding you instantly. The filter offered little more than a prayer against the chemical horror rolling towards them. Hitler, like everyone else, was fighting for his life before a single shot was fired. His hands would have been shaking as he pulled the claustrophobic mask over his head. The world outside became a muffled, blurry nightmare. The only sound was the desperate rasp of his own breath, hot and loud inside the mask. He would have seen shapes of men falling, writhing on the duckboards, their own masks forgotten or fitted too late. He heard choked screams that were barely whispers through the thick fabric. The gas was a patient hunter. It found every gap, every tear, every moment of hesitation. But where did this chemical ghost come from? It wasn't forged in a steel mill. It was born in a laboratory, in the mind of one of Germany's most brilliant scientists. His name was Fritz Haber. To understand the irony of this moment, you have to understand Haber. He was a German Jew and a fervent patriot. He loved Germany with an intensity that bordered on religious. He saw the trench warfare stalemate as a catastrophic waste of German life. His goal in his own mind was not to create a more horrible weapon. It was to create a decisive one. A weapon so effective it would break the deadlock, force the Allies to surrender, and end the war quickly. He believed he was saving lives. Haber was a genius. Years earlier, he had perfected a process to synthesize ammonia from nitrogen in the air. This discovery, the Haber-Bosch process, allowed Germany to mass-produce artificial fertilizers. It revolutionized agriculture worldwide. Fritz Haber is the reason the planet can support a population of billions, the man who fed the world. Now, he applied that same genius to killing. He personally oversaw the first chlorine gas attack at Ypres in 1915. He calculated wind speeds and gas densities, treating it all as a complex scientific problem. He saw the soldiers not as men, but as variables in an equation. His wife, Clara Immerwahr, also a brilliant chemist, saw it differently. She called his work a perversion of science and begged him to stop. After a dinner party celebrating the success of the first attack, she took his service revolver and ended her own life. The next morning, Haber left for the Eastern Front to oversee another gas attack. His duty to Germany came first. Back in the trench, Hitler survived. The gas cloud passed. The all clear was given. Men cautiously, shakily, removed their masks. They breathed in the now poisoned air, their lungs burning. The scene around them was from a nightmare. The bodies of the dead were everywhere. They hadn't been torn apart by shrapnel. They were perfectly intact, but their skin was a sickly yellow-black. Their faces were frozen in masks of agony. Greenish froth covered their lips. They had drowned on dry land, their lungs dissolved by Haber's chemical creation. Corporal Hitler had just faced a weapon pioneered by a Jewish patriot who was desperate to save the German nation, a man who won a Nobel Prize in chemistry in 1918, the same year the war ended. Think about that for a moment. The world celebrated the scientist who fed the hungry, while trying to forget the scientist who taught men how to poison the very air. Can a person be both a hero and a monster of science? The 20th century would be defined by that question. For Hitler, the experience was visceral. It was a new kind of fear, a bayonet, a bullet, a shell. These were tangible things, but this was an invisible enemy, an insidious poison that seeped into the safest corners of his trench. It was a profound violation. The attack didn't break him, but it added another layer of trauma, another dark memory to the collection festering in his mind. He survived the poison wind, but the idea of poison itself was now lodged deep inside him, waiting for a narrative, waiting for a scapegoat. A weapon created by a German Jew had nearly ended his life. How would a mind like his, already prone to resentment and blame, process that fact in the years of chaos to come? While Corporal Hitler was fighting in the trenches, Germany itself was beginning to starve. The British naval blockade was a python, slowly squeezing the life out of the nation. This is the story of the turnip winter. It's the story of how the first cracks appeared in German society, and how the seeds of a bitter revolution were sown in frozen, barren ground. The attack came without warning, October 1916. The Somme front. One moment, Hitler was sharing a piece of dry bread with Fuchsel, the little white terrier that had become his shadow. The next, the sky screamed and the earth bucked. It was a routine British artillery barrage, impersonal and indiscriminate. He did what every soldier did, threw himself into the mud at the bottom of the trench, pulling the trembling dog close. The world dissolved into dirt and noise. A giant hammer pounded the ground again and again. He could feel the shock waves through his bones, his face pressed into the wet earth, tasting grit, waiting for the storm to pass. Then a sharp, violent impact against his left leg, a pain so intense it felt hot, like a branding iron. He cried out, a sound swallowed by the roar of a nearby exploding shell. When the shelling finally subsided, the silence was deafening, broken only by the groans of the wounded. His leg throbbed. He pushed himself up, his hand shaking, and then he saw it. A jagged piece of English steel had torn through the small white body of his terrier before burying itself deep in his thigh. Fuchsel was gone. The one creature on the front that offered simple, uncomplicated affection was now just another casualty of the mud. The pain in his leg was immense, but the cold emptiness that washed over him was far worse. He was evacuated, carried on a stretcher, then loaded onto a hospital train. For 2 years, the front had been his entire world. Now, as the train rattled back towards the fatherland, he watched the scarred landscape of France slowly give way to the green fields of Germany. He was going home, but the home he remembered, the one from the cheering crowds of 1914, no longer existed. He ended up in a military hospital at Belitz, just outside Berlin. A clean bed, white sheets, 3 meals a day. It should have been a paradise compared to the trenches. But something was wrong. The spirit was gone. He listened to the other wounded soldiers. Their talk wasn't of honor or duty or the final victory. It was of home, of empty shelves and hungry children. One evening, a man in the bed next to him, a corporal who had lost an arm at Verdun, was staring at a letter from his wife. The man finally looked up, his eyes hollow. He spoke in a quiet whisper. "Victory? Who cares about victory? My wife writes that my children are eating bread made with sawdust." Sawdust. "I'd surrender tomorrow to feed them." Hitler said nothing. He just stared at the man. He felt no pity, no compassion, only a cold rising tide of contempt. This was the rot, the weakness the newspapers at the front never mentioned. This man, a German soldier, was willing to throw away all the sacrifice, all the blood spilled, for a loaf of bread. In Hitler's mind, a chasm was opening. On one side were the soldiers at the front, pure in their sacrifice. On the other was everyone else. Once he could walk with a cane, he was given leave and took a train into Berlin. He wanted to see the heart of the empire, to feel the patriotic will that fueled the war machine. He found something else entirely. The air itself smelled different. Not of cordite and decay, but of poverty. A pervasive, sickly sweet odor of boiling turnips hung over the city. It was the smell of starvation. The faces on the street were pale and gaunt. Children played listlessly, their limbs thin, their bellies swollen from malnutrition. In the queues that snaked around every corner for bread or coal, you could hear a constant dry coughing. It was the sound of a city slowly succumbing to hunger and disease. The vibrant, powerful capital he had imagined was a ghost of itself, draped in gray and shadow. One afternoon, limping on his cane, he entered a small bakery. The shelves were mostly empty. What little bread there was looked wrong. It was dark, dense, and heavy. The infamous Kriegsbrot war bread, made more from potato flour and turnip meal than actual grain. He stood in line, his stomach churning with a mix of hunger and disgust. Ahead of him were 2 men, well dressed in civilian coats, their faces plump and their cheeks rosy. They were complaining to each other in low, conspiratorial tones. "Can you believe this swill?" one of them said, poking at a loaf. "It's an insult. My dog wouldn't eat this." The other chuckled, a greasy, unpleasant sound. "Don't worry," he said. "At least the fools dying for us in France are getting better rations, eh? Keeps them marching." Hitler froze. His hand tightened on the handle of his cane until his knuckles were white. Every word was a physical blow. Fools! These men, safe and warm in Berlin, were calling him and his comrades fools. They were mocking the sacrifice, the death, the horror. He saw the dead face of his dog. He saw the armless soldier in the hospital bed. He saw 2 years of his life spent in a muddy hole. And these parasites were complaining about their bread. He wanted to scream, to bring the cane down on their smug, well-fed faces, but he didn't. He was still just Corporal Hitler, an awkward, unknown soldier. He said nothing. He just watched them, his eyes burning with a hatred so pure it felt like a physical force inside him. He turned and left the bakery without buying anything. He had lost his appetite. In that moment, his war changed. The enemy was no longer just the British or the French, a clear target across a field of barbed wire. The enemy was also here. It was the war profiteer, the complaining civilian, the weak-willed politician, the striking factory worker. It was the November criminals before November had even arrived. The home front wasn't supporting the army. In his mind, it was betraying it. His recovery became a race. He pushed himself in physical therapy, desperate to be declared fit for duty. The sterile quiet of the hospital, the defeated whispers of the wounded, the grim reality of Berlin, it was all a poison. The front, a place of constant death and terror, now seemed like a sanctuary. It was honest. It was pure. There, a man knew who his enemies were. There, he was surrounded by brothers who understood sacrifice. In early 1917, he was finally cleared to return to his regiment. He left Berlin without a single look back. He was leaving behind a Germany he no longer recognized, a nation he now believed was unworthy of the blood being spilled in its name. He returned to the war more fanatical than ever, but the Germany he was fighting for was already starting to collapse from within. Which would break first, Hitler or his country? Summer 1918. Germany is on the brink of collapse. Its armies are exhausted. Its people are starving. But its leaders have one last card to play. Not a new weapon, not a brilliant military plan. It's a story, a lie so powerful it will outlive them all. This is the story of how that lie was born. The great German spring offensive had failed. After 4 years of brutal, grinding warfare, this was meant to be the final push, the one that would break the Allied lines before the Americans arrived in force. For a few weeks, it seemed to work. German stormtroopers punched deep into enemy territory. Bells rang out in Berlin, but the momentum stalled. The offensive bled itself white against a wall of resistance. Now, the tide had turned. The Allies, bolstered by 2 million fresh American soldiers, launched their own counterattack. It was called the 100 Days Offensive, and for the German army, it was a catastrophe. The lines didn't just bend, they shattered. Entire divisions dissolved. Soldiers surrendered by the tens of thousands. The war machine that had terrified Europe for 4 years was sputtering, breaking down, running on fumes. And at the heart of that machine, in the quiet, map-lined rooms of the Supreme Army Command in Spa, Belgium, one man understood the horrifying truth. His name was Erich Ludendorff, Quartermaster General of the German Army. He was the true brain of the German war effort, a man of immense intellect, iron will, and terrifying ambition. For years, he had been the de facto dictator of Germany, a symbol of Prussian military might. He was a man who never countenanced defeat. But the numbers on the pages in front of him did not lie. The reports from the front were unambiguous. It was over. On September 29, 1918, Ludendorff convened a secret meeting with the highest echelons of the military and government. The mood in the room was not panic. It was a cold, grim acceptance of the inevitable. Ludendorff stood before them, not as a triumphant general, but as the bearer of catastrophic news. He laid it out with clinical precision. The army could no longer hold the front. A collapse was imminent. An armistice had to be requested immediately. Not in a month, not in a week, now. Imagine the shock. For 4 years, the German people had been fed a steady diet of propaganda. They were told of glorious victories, of the Army's unbreakable spirit. They were told the war was defensive, a noble struggle for Germany's survival. They had endured unimaginable hardship, the starvation of the turnip winter, the loss of sons, fathers, and brothers, all in the belief that victory was just around the corner. And now, the men who had promised them that victory were admitting behind closed doors that it was all a fantasy. The war was lost. But this is where the story takes its dark turn. For Ludendorff, admitting military defeat was one thing. Accepting responsibility for it was another, entirely. The German army, in his mind, was a sacred institution. It was the soul of the nation. It could not be seen to have failed. If the army had not failed, then someone else must be to blame. The defeat couldn't have happened on the battlefield. It must have come from behind. And so, in that room, a new strategy was born. A psychological operation, a plan to save the honor of the military by shifting the blame onto a new enemy, the home front. Ludendorff outlined the plan. The request for an armistice would not come from the military. It would come from a new civilian government, a democratic one. Let them be the ones to surrender. Let them be the ones to sign the humiliating treaty that was sure to follow. The generals, the architects of the war, would step back into the shadows. They would let the politicians take the fall. It was a brilliant, cynical move. The very men who knew the army was beaten to its knees were now crafting a narrative where the army was never beaten at all. They were undefeated in the field, they would claim. They were stabbed in the back, the Dolchstoßlegende, the stab in the back myth. Who held the dagger? The scapegoats were chosen with cold calculation. The striking workers who had protested the war, the socialists and communists calling for revolution, and of course the Jews, a convenient target for centuries of European paranoia. The narrative was simple, poisonous, and deeply seductive. The brave German soldier wasn't defeated by the enemy. He was betrayed by traitors at home. What is more dangerous, a lie you're told or a lie you desperately want to believe? For a nation reeling from the trauma of war and the shock of sudden defeat, the stab in the back myth was a powerful anesthetic. It offered a simple explanation for a complex disaster. It replaced national shame with righteous anger. It gave them someone to hate. It preserved the one institution they still revered, the army. The lie was a seed, planted in the fertile soil of a nation's humiliation. And while General Ludendorff was carefully constructing this political time bomb in his quiet headquarters, Corporal Adolf Hitler was miles away, living a completely different reality. He was on the Western Front, in the mud and chaos of the Ypres salient in Belgium. He knew nothing of the secret meetings in Spa, nothing of the strategic decision that the war was lost. He, like millions of other soldiers, still believed the propaganda. He still believed in Germany's strength, in the ultimate victory that had been promised. He was a true believer, unaware that the high priests of his faith were already preparing for the collapse of their own church. The lie is crafted, the story written. It waits for an audience, for a voice to give it power, a fanatic to make it his own. Meanwhile, on the front lines, the war grinds on. In the early hours of October 14, 1918, near the village of Vervik, Hitler and his comrades are hunkered down in a trench. A strange calm hangs in the air. Then the British artillery begins. These are not the usual high-explosive shells. They land with a dull thud, releasing a thick, oily yellow-green vapor that clings to the ground, a cloud of British mustard gas. And Adolf Hitler is about to be made blind. How will these two events, a political calculation and a chemical burn, collide to shape the future of the world? October 1918. A British artillery shell lands nearby. It's not the explosive blast that poses the greatest danger, but the poison the shell releases. For Corporal Adolf Hitler, the world is about to go dark. The war is in its final convulsive moments. The German lines, once an unbreakable wall, are crumbling. The men are exhausted. Replacements are too young, veterans too tired. 4 years of this has hollowed out an entire generation. The air on the Western Front has its own smell, a mixture of mud, iron, decay, and fear. But on this day near Ypres, a new scent joins the chorus. It rolls in low and slow, a yellow-green mist clinging to the craters. It smells strange, almost spicy. Some say like garlic, others like mustard. Unlike the shriek of an incoming shell, this killer arrives with a whisper. Hitler and his comrades see the cloud. There's a frantic scramble for the gas masks, the clumsy pig-snouted devices that are supposed to be their salvation. But the gas is fast. It seeps into everything. It doesn't need to be breathed in to do its work. It attacks the skin, settling on any moist surface. The eyes are its most vulnerable target. For Hitler, it begins as an itch on his face and hands. Then the itch becomes a burn, a slow chemical fire crawling across his skin. He can feel his lungs tightening, each breath a ragged effort. But the worst is for his eyes. They start to water, then to sting. Within minutes, the stinging feels like hot sand being ground into them. He blinks, but that only makes it worse. The world blurs into a watery, painful haze. Panic sets in. This isn't a clean wound from a bullet. This is a poison dissolving him from the outside in. He stumbles back from the creeping mist, hands clawing at his face. He rips the mask off, a desperate, fatal mistake. The concentrated gas hits him full on. The pain in his eyes explodes into a searing, blinding agony. The world dissolves into white-hot light, and then nothing. Just a thick, impenetrable blackness. He screams, but the sound is a choked whisper swallowed by his own burning throat. He is blind, a soldier on an active battlefield, completely blind. The sounds around him are amplified into a terrifying chorus. The rattle of a distant machine gun, the wet slap of boots in the mud, the screams of other men caught in the same toxic cloud. He tries to stand, but his legs betray him. He falls, his hands flailing in the dark, searching for anything solid. But there is only the cold, wet earth and the sound of his own ragged breathing. Imagine it. You are plunged into a world without sight, but not without sensation. You can still feel the chemical burns on your skin, the fire in your lungs. You can still hear the war raging around you, but you cannot see the threat. You cannot see the path to safety. You are an island of terrified blackness in a sea of chaos. This is Hitler's reality. He is no longer a dispatch runner, no longer a corporal. He is just a piece of suffering flesh waiting for the next shell or the final embrace of the gas. Then a hand grabs his arm. A voice shouts something he can't understand. He is pulled to his feet, dragged, half carried through the trench. The journey is a blur of stumbling, falling, and excruciating pain. He has no idea where he's going, his entire universe reduced to the grip on his arm and the darkness in his head. He's loaded onto a truck, then a train. The roar of the front fades, replaced by the rhythmic clatter of wheels on steel and the groans of other wounded men. He is being evacuated, sent away from the fight. But in his mind, the fight is far from over. He ends up in a military hospital in Passawalk, Pomerania. The doctors' voices are calm, professional. They talk about chemical conjunctivitis, damage to the cornea. They tell him the blindness is temporary, a common symptom of mustard gas exposure. His eyes are heavily bandaged. He lies in a clean bed with white sheets, a world away from the mud of Flanders. The physical diagnosis was straightforward, but with this particular corporal, something else was happening. His blindness was real, the pain undeniable. His entire identity was tied to the German army and its righteous cause. His worldview was built on a single, unshakable pillar: Germany's inevitable victory. He had recently seen the cracks on the home front, the hunger, the strikes, the talk of peace, and dismissed it all as treason. He refused to see it. He refused to believe the army he idolized could be defeated. And now, the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. The front was collapsing. The war was lost. For a mind so rigidly constructed, this truth was more toxic than any chemical weapon. It threatened to annihilate his very reason for being. The mind has powerful defense mechanisms. To protect itself from a reality it cannot accept, it can force the body to shut down. The doctors saw a victim of mustard gas, but they may have also been looking at a man whose mind was choosing to go blind rather than see the world as it truly was. His physical trauma was merging with his psychological breaking point. He lies there in the hospital, the world outside his bandages gone. He can hear the footsteps of nurses, the hushed conversations of other patients, but he cannot see. He is a man trapped in total darkness, waiting for his sight to return. And in that darkness, news from the outside world is coming. News of revolution in Germany. News of the Kaiser's abdication. News of a final, unthinkable surrender. What will happen when that news reaches a man who has already chosen to shut his eyes to the truth? The man who would deliver the most devastating news of Adolf Hitler's life was not a general or a politician. He was an elderly pastor, his face a mask of grief. He walked slowly into the long, sterile ward of the Passawalk Military Hospital on November 10th, 1918. The air was thick with antiseptic and the quiet suffering of broken men. Corporal Hitler had been here for weeks, confined to a world of hazy shapes and muffled sounds. British mustard gas had seared his eyes. Doctors said the blindness was temporary, but for now, his world was a painful, frustrating blur. He could make out the white of the bed sheets, the dark shapes of men in other cots, but mostly he listened. He listened to the groans, the whispered conversations, the endless gnawing rumors that scuttled through the ward like rats. Just that morning, a man with a shattered leg had leaned over to whisper what he'd heard from a nurse. The fleet had mutinied in Kiel. The sailors had raised the red flag. Another soldier, an older sergeant missing an arm, had scoffed. He called it enemy propaganda, insisting the high command had one last glorious push planned. In the ward, hope and fear circulated like currency. Hitler clung to hope. 4 years of sacrifice, of watching comrades die in mud and blood. It had to mean something. It had to lead to victory. But then the pastor entered. The shuffling of feet stopped. The low murmur of conversation died. A man coughed, and the sound echoed in the sudden, heavy silence. Hitler strained his eyes, trying to make out the man's expression, but all he could see was a dark figure standing at the head of the ward. All he could rely on was his hearing, and what he heard was the sound of a world ending. The pastor's voice trembled. It was the voice of a man forced to read a death sentence. He had come, he began, to bring news from Berlin. A man in a nearby bed drew a sharp, whistling breath. Hitler felt his own heart hammer against his ribs. The pastor paused, as if gathering strength, then delivered the first blow. His Majesty, the Kaiser, had abdicated. A wave of shock rippled through the room, a collective, silent gasp. The Kaiser, the symbol of the German Empire, was gone. Before anyone could process it, the pastor delivered the next blow. A new government had been formed. A republic had been declared. The sergeant with one arm let out a low curse, muttering about Republicans and Marxists. And then came the final fatal strike. The pastor's voice dropped to a near whisper, filled with an unbearable sorrow. That morning, at 5 a.m., an armistice had been signed. The fighting had stopped. The war was over. For a moment, there was absolute silence, broken only by the sharp clatter of a crutch falling to the floor. Then a young soldier began to sob, not with grief, but with a wrenching, gasping sound of pure relief. He cried out that they were going home. Another man started to laugh, a strange, hysterical sound. But Hitler heard none of it. The sounds of the ward dissolved into a high-pitched ringing in his ears. The blurry world in front of him swam and then went black. It was not the relief of survival. It was the abyss of total catastrophic failure, all the death, all the pain, his friends, his regiment, the gas, the mud, the Iron Cross pinned to his tunic. For nothing, utterly, humiliatingly for nothing. He felt a hot pressure build behind his bandaged eyes. He stumbled from his chair, knocking it over as he fumbled his way back to his cot. He fell onto the thin mattress and buried his head in the coarse, lumpy pillow. And for the first time since his mother died, Adolf Hitler wept. These were not tears of sadness for fallen comrades or relief that the killing had stopped. They were hot, burning tears of pure, undiluted rage, a fury so immense it felt it would split him in two. How could this happen? He believed they were not defeated in the field. He had been there. He had seen it. The German soldier was the best in the world, holding the line against impossible odds. His mind, reeling in the darkness, began to search for an answer. And in that desperate search, it found the narrative that had been so carefully prepared. The lie engineered by General Ludendorff in his distant map-filled headquarters was about to find its most fervent believer. He didn't picture the faces of the British soldiers who had fired the gas shell that blinded him. He pictured the faces he had seen on leave in Berlin the year before. The gaunt, sullen faces of striking factory workers. The politicians in their fine suits, talking of a peace resolution. The headlines in the newspapers he despised, questioning the war effort. The pieces clicked into place in his fevered mind. It wasn't the enemy at the front. It was the enemy at home. The November criminals. The Marxists who stirred up the sailors to mutiny. The Jews who owned the newspapers and banks, profiting from Germany's demise. In his mind, they had not been defeated. They had been betrayed, stabbed in the back by the very people they had fought to protect. In that moment, lying in a hospital bed, any line between genuine grief and cynical opportunism dissolved. He needed a villain, a target for his all-consuming rage. The story General Ludendorff had written was waiting for its lead actor. The national humiliation became his personal humiliation. The nation's desire for revenge became his personal mission. The burning in his eyes was nothing compared to the fire that now consumed his soul. The weeping subsided, replaced by a cold, terrifying resolve. He would later claim that in this moment of total darkness, his life's purpose became clear. He would not return to painting postcards. He would not fade back into the anonymity he had fled in 1914. He would enter politics. He would make them pay, all of them. The blindness from the gas was temporary, but the hatred he found in that darkness would last a lifetime, and he would make sure the entire world would see it. Adolf Hitler's blindness wasn't caused by shrapnel. It wasn't a physical wound. The diagnosis was hysterical blindness, a condition where the mind, overwhelmed by trauma, simply turns off the eyes. His sight was taken by his own rage, and it was restored by a psychiatrist named Edmund Forster, but the cure may not have been medical. A controversial theory suggests Forster used hypnosis. And in trying to calm one man's hysteria, he accidentally unleashed a messianic complex upon the world. The military hospital in Passawalk, Pomerania, was a quiet place of immense suffering, a repository for men the war had broken in ways a bandage could not fix. Here, the enemy wasn't in an opposing trench, but inside a soldier's own head. The corridors echoed not with groans of physical pain, but with the chilling silence of vacant stares, or the sudden shouts of men reliving an artillery barrage in their sleep. This was the domain of Dr. Edmund Forster. Forster was no fringe practitioner. He was a respected neurologist and psychiatrist, a professor at the University of Greifswald, who had published papers on the psychological toll of modern warfare. He was a man of science and a patriot. He saw his duty as salvaging the minds of Germany's fighting men. He'd seen the soldier who could not stop shaking, his hands vibrating with the memory of a machine gun. The officer who could no longer speak, his throat constricted by unspoken horrors. Forster believed in order, discipline, and the power of the German spirit to overcome any adversity. He saw his patients not as broken, but as temporarily derailed. And he had developed techniques to coax their minds back from the brink. Imagine one of those men, a young corporal from Saxony, sitting rigidly on his cot, staring at hands that tremble uncontrollably. Dr. Forster sits with him, his voice calm and steady. He doesn't coddle the man. He speaks of duty, of the fatherland, of the strength that lies dormant within every German. He tells the soldier that his hands will be still when he commands them to be, when he remembers his purpose. For many, this approach worked. It provided a framework of order in a mind consumed by chaos. It was the standard psychiatric practice of its time. And into this world of controlled therapy came patient number 78, Corporal Adolf Hitler. But Hitler was different. He wasn't catatonic or shaking. He was consumed by a cold, burning rage. The news of Germany's surrender, delivered by a pastor, had been the final blow. A betrayal so profound it plunged him into literal darkness. His blindness was a wall, shutting out a world that had failed him. He lay in his bed, listening to the sounds of the hospital, his mind replaying every perceived injustice. The politicians in Berlin, the strikers, the Jews. He had built a fortress of blame, and he was its sole prisoner. This is where the official record becomes hazy, and the theory begins. There are no surviving session notes. Forster himself would later be persecuted by the Nazis and take his own life. But evidence, pieced together from letters and accounts, suggests Forster decided on a radical course of treatment. He would use hypnosis. He would enter the darkness with his patient. Picture the scene, a small sterile room. Hitler sits, his eyes either bandaged or staring unseeing. Forster's voice is the only other presence, calm, authoritative, hypnotic. The doctor doesn't talk about trauma or the horrors of the trenches. He does something far more dangerous. He validates Hitler's rage. He takes the paranoid narrative swirling in the corporal's mind and gives it structure. He gives it a name, the stab in the back. Forster would have known about the Dolchstoßlegende, the stab in the back myth. The lie, started by Germany's own high command, was already spreading through the army like a virus. Forster, the patriot, likely believed it himself. And so he reframes his patient's condition. His voice cuts through the fury. Your blindness, Corporal, is a symptom of a greater sickness. Germany itself has been blinded by traitors. They did this to Germany, and they did this to you. Your suffering is Germany's suffering. The words are a key turning a lock in Hitler's mind. His personal humiliation is fused with the national humiliation. His desire for recovery becomes a national mission. Forster presses his advantage, planting the suggestion. Germany has been laid low, but it will rise again. It needs men of immense, unbreakable will, men who can see the future when others are blind. You have a part to play, Corporal, a great destiny, but to fulfill it, you must see. You must will yourself to see. Your conviction can burn away this darkness. Your resolve is the cure. Forster is telling him that his fate and Germany's are intertwined, that a man chosen for great things cannot be held back by such an affliction. It is a test of his inner strength. And then something happens, a flicker, a twitch behind the eyelids, a shape emerges from the gray fog. Light, painful at first, floods his optic nerves. The cure is working. The hysterical blindness recedes. Adolf Hitler can see again. He opens his eyes, blinking in the dim light of the hospital room. Imagine him, a day or two later, standing before a small, cracked mirror. He studies his own reflection for the first time in weeks. The gaunt face, the hollow cheeks, the unfamiliar mustache. But there is no relief, no joy in his eyes. There is only a new and terrifying certainty. The man looking back is no longer a failed artist, no longer a mere corporal. He is a man with a purpose. The doctor's words echo in his mind. He has passed the test. He has willed his sight back into existence. His recovery is proof of his own exceptional nature, proof of his destiny. The treatment that restored his physical sight has cemented his fanatical political vision. Could a single therapy session have changed the course of history? It's a deeply unsettling question. Dr. Forster, in his attempt to heal one soldier, may have inadvertently convinced that soldier he was a savior. He weaponized his patient's trauma, aiming it not towards healing, but towards a messianic purpose. His sight is restored. His purpose is clear, but the world he is returning to is a nation in chaos. What happens when this man is released into the political powder keg of post-war Germany? Discharged from Passewalk, his sight restored by a force of will he was only beginning to understand, Corporal Hitler was sent back to his regiment's depot in Munich. The war was over, but for Germany and for him, a new war was just beginning. When he stepped off the train in late November 1918, he did not find a nation quietly mourning its loss. He found a city in the grip of a fever. He found a revolution. The air in the Munich Central Station was thick with the smell of coal smoke and cheap tobacco. It was a familiar scent, but everything else was alien. Where the black, white, and red flags of the German Empire should have hung, there were only blood-red banners of the socialists. Men with rifles slung over their civilian coats patrolled the platforms. They wore red armbands and looked at his field-gray uniform with open contempt. They were not soldiers. They were a mob. As he moved through the crowd, a scene unfolded that stopped him cold. A young lieutenant, his face pale and his uniform immaculate, was surrounded by a group of armed workers. One of them, a burly man with a greasy cap, spat on the ground near the officer's polished boots. "Your games are over, aristocrat," he sneered. Then, with a quick, violent motion, he ripped the epaulets from the lieutenant's shoulders. The officer stood frozen, his hands clenched into fists, his face a mask of humiliation. No one intervened, no one dared. Hitler felt a surge of cold fury rise in his chest. This was the homecoming he had been given. This was the thanks for 4 years in the trenches. He made his way to the List Regiment's barracks, expecting to find the familiar comfort of military order, a last island of discipline in a sea of chaos. He was wrong. The barracks were almost unrecognizable. The authority of the officers had evaporated. In its place were the so-called soldiers' councils, committees of enlisted men who now debated every order and voted on their own duties. One afternoon, he stood in the shadows of a corridor watching. A sergeant, a veteran with a face like worn leather, was trying to organize a work detail. A young private, barely old enough to shave, stood with his arms crossed, a smirk on his face. "We'll have a vote on that, Sergeant," the boy said, his voice dripping with condescension. "The council has to approve any work that isn't directly related to our own welfare." The sergeant's face went purple, but he said nothing. He simply turned and walked away, defeated. Hitler watched the exchange without moving a muscle. He saw the rot. He saw the poison that had seeped from the cities into the heart of the army itself. "This," he thought, "is why we lost. The enemy wasn't in France. It was here." He existed in a state of limbo for months. a soldier with no war to fight, living in a city he no longer recognized. Munich was now the capital of the Bavarian Soviet Republic. The streets became a battleground. Communist militias clashed with returning soldiers who had formed paramilitary groups called the Freikorps. Gunshots echoed in the beer halls. Political assassinations were a weekly occurrence. Hitler watched it all, a silent, seething observer. He saw the world he had fought for, the world of order, authority, and national pride, being torn apart. Then, in May of 1919, the tide turned. The central government in Berlin sent in the army and the Freikorps to crush the Munich Revolution. The fighting was street by street, house by house. It was brutal and merciless. When the red flags were finally torn down, a wave of reprisals began. Hitler was standing on a street corner near the university when he saw it. A Freikorps patrol, their steel helmets grim and their faces hard, dragged 3 men from a tenement building. The men were accused of being Red Guards. There was no trial. There was no argument. They were shoved up against a brick wall. Hitler heard the sharp crack of rifle bolts being drawn back. He heard the officer give a single, clipped command. The volley of shots was deafening in the narrow street. The bodies crumpled to the cobblestones. The patrol moved on, looking for their next target. Hitler didn't flinch. He didn't look away. As he watched, a subtle change came over him. His back straightened, his jaw set. This wasn't chaos. This was order being restored. This was the necessary surgery to cut the cancer out of Germany. His own future was uncertain. He was waiting for his discharge papers, expecting to be cast back into the anonymous, aimless life he had led before the war. The thought filled him with a quiet dread. But the army wasn't finished with him. One morning, he was summoned to an office. Behind a desk sat Captain Karl Mayer, an officer from the Army's Intelligence and Propaganda Division. Mayer had Hitler's file in front of him. He saw a soldier with a spotless record, a man twice decorated for bravery, a man who had served for 4 years without a single disciplinary issue. He also saw a man adrift, filled with resentment and looking for a purpose, a perfect instrument. "Corporal Hitler," Mayer began, his voice calm and professional, "your record is exemplary. You are a patriot. You've seen what these traitors have done to our country, to our city. The fighting in the streets may be over, but the real war, the war for Germany's soul, has just begun. It's a battle of ideas. We need men who understand this, men who can identify the enemy within." Hitler listened, his attention absolute. This was the first time an officer had spoken to him not as a subordinate, but as a peer, as a fellow believer. "We are forming a new unit," Mayer continued, "an anti-Bolshevik investigation commando. Your job will be to attend the meetings of these new political parties springing up all over Munich. There are dozens of them. Socialists, separatists, nationalists. We need to know who they are, what they believe, who is a threat, and who might be an asset. Think of it as a new kind of front line, Corporal, perhaps the most important one." He wasn't being discharged. He was being given a new mission. He was being told that his anger, his paranoia, his hatred for the forces that had brought Germany to its knees were not just feelings. They were qualifications. He was being given official permission to nurture his obsessions. The army had just given an angry, paranoid, and intensely devoted man a new job to go to political meetings and listen. He was no longer just a forgotten corporal. He was an intelligence agent. And in the smoky back rooms of Munich's beer halls, he was about to find much more than just information. He was about to find his voice. In September 1919, Adolf Hitler was sent to investigate a tiny, insignificant political group called the German Workers' Party. He went as a spy for the army. He would soon leave as its leader. This was the moment the soldier became a politician. The war was over, but Hitler was still in uniform. The trenches were gone, but the army still had a use for him. He was no longer a dispatch runner dodging shells on the Western Front. His new battlefield was Munich itself. The city was a cauldron of political extremism, bubbling with dozens of tiny, angry parties. Communists, socialists, monarchists, and nationalists of every shade met in the back rooms of beer halls, plotting revolutions over cheap lager. The army, the same institution that had secretly blamed civilians for Germany's defeat, was now terrified of the chaos it had helped create. So it created a new kind of soldier, an intelligence agent, an Aufklärungsmann. Their job was to infiltrate these groups, listen to their speeches, and report back on who was a threat. Corporal Hitler, loyal and seemingly dependable, was perfect for the job. He was given some basic training and sent into the city's political underworld. On the 12th of September, he received his assignment: attend a meeting of the German Workers' Party, the DAP. It was a nobody organization, a fringe group founded by a railroad locksmith named Anton Drexler. Hitler had never even heard of them. He expected another evening of boring speeches and bitter arguments, just another report to file. He found the meeting in the Sterneckebräu beer hall, not in the main hall full of noise and music, but in a small, dimly lit side room. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer and cigar smoke. About 25 people were there, mostly working-class men, their faces etched with the hardships of the post-war world. Hitler took a seat in the back, ordered a beer, and prepared to be unimpressed. The first speaker, an economist named Gottfried Feder, delivered a rambling lecture on the evils of international finance capital. Hitler listened, bored. These were ideas he had heard 100 times before in the barracks. It was nothing new, nothing dangerous. He scribbled a few notes, ready to leave. But then another man was given the floor, a Professor Baumann. He argued that Bavaria should break away from Prussia, secede from Germany, and form a new, independent South German nation, possibly with Austria. For Hitler, this was blasphemy. He had not suffered for 4 years in the trenches for Bavaria. He had not been gassed and blinded for a regional flag. He had fought and bled for Germany, for the Reich. The idea of breaking that nation apart, the nation for which millions had just died, was more than a political disagreement. It was a personal, profound insult, the ultimate betrayal. Something inside him snapped. He felt a hot surge of rage, the same blind fury he had felt in the hospital when he heard of the armistice. His orders were to observe, to be invisible. But he couldn't stop himself. He was on his feet before he even realized it. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to the intense, unknown soldier in the back. he began to speak, and the voice that came out was not the quiet, awkward voice of Corporal Hitler. It was a torrent, a furious, passionate, unstoppable flood of words. He didn't debate the professor's points. He demolished them. He attacked the man's character, his patriotism, his very right to call himself a German. He spoke of the sacrifice of the soldiers, the unity forged in blood and fire. He painted the professor's idea as a craven act of treason, another stab in the back of the glorious army. The professor was stunned. He turned pale and left the room without another word, utterly defeated. The rest of the audience was mesmerized. They had never heard anything like it. This wasn't the dry academic language of politicians. This was raw, primal emotion. This was the voice of the trenches brought into a beer hall. For a failed artist and an aimless drifter, this was a moment of discovery. Adolf Hitler found the one thing he was truly good at. It wasn't painting, it was speaking. He could channel all his personal resentment, all his hatred and paranoid fears into words that held an audience captive. In that dingy back room, he found his weapon. As the meeting broke up, Hitler, still shaking with adrenaline, turned to leave. But a man blocked his path. Anton Drexler, the party's founder. With a look of awe on his face, Drexler told him his speech was incredible. He said Hitler had the gift of the gab, and that the party could use a man like him. Drexler pressed a small 40-page pamphlet into Hitler's hand. Its title was My Political Awakening. He urged Hitler to read it and to come to the next meeting. The spy sent to observe had been recruited by his target. The entire purpose of his mission was turned on its head. Hitler walked back to the barracks that night in a daze. He couldn't sleep. He lay on his cot and by candlelight read Drexler's pamphlet. The writing was clumsy, the ideas simplistic, but they resonated with him. It was all there. The nationalism, the anti-Semitism, the hatred of the Versailles Treaty, the belief in a powerful, authoritarian state. It was a crude reflection of the very ideology brewing in his own mind. He thought about his future. Without the army, all that awaited him was a return to poverty and anonymity. He was a man without a trade, without an education, without a home. All he possessed was his rage. The German Workers' Party was pathetic, a tiny gathering of misfits. But it was something. It was a vessel, and he had just discovered he had a voice that could fill it. 2 days later, he made his decision. He applied for membership and was accepted as committee member number 7. His mission as a spy was over. A new one was just beginning. He had found a political home for his rage and a stage for his voice. Now he would begin to build his power. The failed artist from Vienna was gone. The oddball corporal was gone. In their place was a man who had found his purpose. The story of Corporal Hitler in the Great War is over, but the story of the monster it created was just beginning. He stood in the smoky back room of the Sterneckerbräu beer hall as the words poured out of him, unfiltered, furious. The small crowd of disgruntled men in the German Workers' Party listened. For the first time in his life, people listened. The Army intelligence officer sent to spy on the group had just found his mission. But it wasn't the mission his superiors had given him. Within days, he applied for membership and was accepted. His party card listed him as member number 55. It was a tiny, powerless group, just a handful of men arguing politics over stale beer in a city on the verge of collapse. For anyone else, it would be a dead end. For Hitler, it was a blank canvas. He threw himself into the work. The awkward loner from the trenches, the man who rarely spoke to his comrades, was now organizing meetings and designing pamphlets. He was tireless. The army continued to pay his salary, thinking he was their informant. They were unknowingly funding the creation of their future master. His real weapon, he discovered, was not a rifle or a grenade. It was his voice. At first, his speeches were clumsy, his gestures wild and stiff, but the rage was authentic. He railed against the humiliation of the armistice and the politicians who signed the surrender, branding them the November criminals. He spoke of the chaos on the streets of Munich, a city that now felt alien and broken. And he gave the people a target for their anger. He took the lie he had learned in the Possewalk Hospital, the lie engineered by General Ludendorff himself, and he polished it. He sharpened it into a weapon. The German army was not defeated on the battlefield, he roared. It was stabbed in the back, stabbed by enemies at home. The themes were simple, brutal, and effective. They were the lessons he had learned in the mud and the gas. The world is a struggle for survival. The strong dominate the weak. Loyalty is everything, and betrayal is the ultimate sin. He was describing the war, but he was applying it to politics, to society, to life itself. The small party needed a new identity, something more potent. He pushed for a name change. National Socialist German Workers' Party. It was a mouthful, but it was clever. It promised something for everyone. Nationalism for the conservatives, socialism for the workers, a party for all true Germans. And it needed a symbol, something to rival the communists' hammer and sickle. Hitler took it upon himself to design it. He settled on ancient symbols, twisting them for his own purpose. He placed a black swastika inside a white circle, set against a blood-red background, the colors of the old German Empire reborn with a terrifying new energy. It was graphic, it was aggressive, it was impossible to ignore. The crowd started to grow, first dozens, then 100, then several hundred packed into the beer halls to hear him speak. He would start slowly, his voice low, recounting the glories of the front and the sacrifice of the soldiers. Then he would pivot. His voice would rise to a shout as he spit out his venom against the traitors, the profiteers, the Marxists, and, above all, the Jews. He wove them into a grand conspiracy, a single, unified enemy responsible for every problem Germany faced. The man who had found his only real companion in a stray dog named Fuchsel now offered a new kind of belonging. He promised to build a new national community, a Volksgemeinschaft, a brotherhood forged not in the trenches, but in shared blood and shared hatred. He was rebuilding his regiment, but this time he would be its leader. The belief that had supposedly cured his blindness, the idea that pure, unrelenting willpower could overcome any physical obstacle, now became the core of his political faith. Germany was not weak, he claimed. It was poisoned. It was asleep. And he was the one who could awaken it. Through sheer force of will, he would make Germany strong again. It was a crucial turning point. The moment a soldier's personal trauma became a political program, his grievance became a nation's ideology. The language of the trenches began to infect the language of politics. The hunt for a scapegoat replaced the search for a solution. An ordinary man, broken by an extraordinary war, had found a way to channel his pain outward, to make his personal demons the demons of an entire nation. And what of the men who shaped this soldier, the men who, in their own small ways, set him on his path? Their fates provide the story's final chilling postscript. Hugo Gutmann, the Jewish lieutenant who saw diligence and courage in Corporal Hitler, the man who recommended him for the Iron Cross First Class, an award Hitler would wear for the rest of his life. After Hitler came to power, Gutmann was stripped of his German citizenship. He was arrested by the Gestapo, but eventually released, fleeing Germany in 1939, a refugee from the man whose bravery he had once certified. And Dr. Edmund Forster, the psychiatrist at the Passawalk Hospital, the specialist in war hysteria, who treated the blind corporal. Historians still debate what happened in those sessions, but some believe Forster used hypnotic suggestion, telling Hitler his blindness was a product of his mind and that he could see again if he truly believed in his destiny. Years later, under the Nazi regime, Forster was hounded. He knew too much. He was a threat. In 1933, with the Gestapo closing in, he took his own life. The doctor who may have unlocked Hitler's will to power was ultimately consumed by it. The very people who played a part in his story became victims of the monster he became. Every piece of his past was either co-opted for his new myth or erased completely. The war created the man, and the man would go on to create a new, even more terrible war.